Section 18 of David Blaize. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. David Blaize by E. F. Benson. Chapter 13. David was sitting on the bank below the pavilion on the last afternoon of the term, waiting for Frank, who was paying certain bills in the town, to join him and take his cricket things away. To save time, David had packed them for him, emptying his locker into his cricket bag, and now it and his own, ready packed, lay beside him on the grass. The plan was to sit here and talk till chapel bell began, when they would take their belongings down and leave them at the lodge in the readiness for the bus to the station next morning. It was their last opportunity of being alone together, for after chapel they would have to go down to their house to dress for concert, and after concert was the house supper in honor of their having won the cricket cup. It would all be exceedingly public and rejoiceful, and Frank would have to make a speech, and David was afraid he would want to groan again instead of applauding, which was quite out of the question, as the occasion was one of uproarious mirth. The last 5 weeks had passed with awful speed. He had worked a good deal. He had played cricket a good deal, and though he had not got into the 11, everything had been tremendously prosperous. He had been tried twice for the 11, once against the next 16, once against a team of old boys from Cambridge, and in both matches he had bowled with considerable success. But then the weather had changed, and instead of the dry, crumbly wickets which suited him, there had been 10 days' rain. Wickets were soft and slow, and certainly would be for the match at Lord's the next day after tomorrow. And David had become about as much use as a practical bowler as a baby in arms would have been. So Crawley, only this morning, had been given the last place in the 11, which was absolutely all right, for Crawley could bat as well, and in the last school match had both taken wickets and made runs, the slow ground suiting his style in both respects. In the same match, Maddox had scored 100 in his inimitable style, and David had shouted himself hoarse, and all these things were dead and done with. Apart from cricket, work had taken up a good deal of his time, and work, mere silly work in a classroom, taken by Mr. Howells, had assumed a different aspect. This had all come out of that talk with Frank when he translated the chorus from Oedipus Coloneus, on which occasion David had realized that Pheidias was a real person, and Pericles a real prime minister, and that Socrates was jolly to young fellows, and told them heavenly stories about the gods. They had all become people who went to the theater like anybody else, and went to Olympia, just as anybody might now go to the Oval, and had playwriters like Aristophanes, who made just the same sort of jokes as people make nowadays. Out of that evening, too, had resulted the fact that David, instead of occupying a modest and unassuming place some way half down the middle fifth, had heard, to his great astonishment, his name read out at the top of that distinguished form. A prize was the consequence of that, presented him that morning at prize-giving by a royal duchess, who said she was very much pleased, which was distinctly civil of her. But all those things were dead also. They had happened. There was but little more to happen, little that mattered. There was the concert, in which David was one of a group of tenors who would take part in the Milton Ode. That would be rather jolly. There was a delightful passage at the end about, "Oh, may we soon renew that song," and the name, "Blessed Pair of Sirens," had an aroma about it. Adams had quoted it to him and Maddox just after Cockhouse match, when he had asked for leave to go down to bathe. What a good day that had been, perhaps the best day of all these dead days. Then after the concert would be the uproarious house supper with a farewell speech from Frank. David felt empty inside at the thought. The field was speckled with groups of boys straying about in the idleness of the last day. Some sat on the grass, some were playing stump cricket, and all seemed unreasonably cheerful. Now and then 2 or 3 passed near him, and he exchanged friendly hellos with them. Sometimes they would ask him to join them in a stroll, but David's reply was always the same: "Sorry, but I promised to wait here for a chap." Then Baggs detached himself from a passing group and sat down by him. David could talk to him with freedom. "Well, Baggs, I feel beastly," he said. "What rot the end of term is." "But you're going to have a rather decent time, aren't you?" asked Baggs. "Oh, yes. There's a cricket week at Baxminster, and they've asked me to play in 2 matches. And it's awfully good of you to want me to come and stay with you. I'll let you know as soon as ever I can. Depends on my pater. Perhaps we're all going to Switzerland." "Come whenever you like," said the faithful Baggs. "I shall be at home all the holidays. I think you might enjoy it. There's a lot of rabbit potting in August, you know, and some partridges in September." "Is it easy to shoot?" asked David. "Lord, yes, I get on all right, and I haven't got your eye." "Well, it's awfully good of you. I should like to come if I may. But I don't care about anything today. Hump, I suppose." Baggs looked out over the yellow green of the midsummer field. "Here's Maddox," he said, "almost running. Wonder what he's in such a hurry for." David sat up. "So he is," he said. "I say, let's sit next each other at house supper. Take a place for me if you get in first. I'm a singer at concert, and singers always get out last." "Righto," said Baggs. He got up quite slowly, and it seemed ridiculous to David that he should not skip away at once, but he still lingered. "I dare say Maddox is coming up to take his cricket things away," he remarked. "I dare say that's it," said David. By a stroke of Providence, Gregson and a friend came by at this moment. "Ripping sport," said Gregson. "Come on, Baggs, there's a terrier at school shop, and they're going to put a ferret into the rat holes. Place will be alive with rats. Coming too, Blazes." "No, hate rats," said David. Baggs departed. A moment after, Frank joined David, just nodded to him, and sat down by him. "Been waiting?" he asked. "Sorry I couldn't get through with my jobs before. Have you stuck my things into my bag? Good work. We can just sit here till chapel bell." "Yes, I emptied your locker," said David. "I stuck everything into your bag, old shoes, old 22 cap, all there was. Afraid I didn't pack it very neatly." "Doesn't matter," said Frank. "Funny that there should be an old 22 cap still there." "Very curious," said David, precisely. Frank gave a short little laugh. "It's all pretty beastly, isn't it?" he said. "You look rather depressed, too. But there's the house supper to cheer you up." "Oh, damn the house supper," said David. Frank's pretense at light conversation broke down. "'Tisn't as if we were going to lose each other," said he. "And we're not dead, either of us, David. Do buck up." "Can't," said David. "Then it's rotten of you. It isn't a bit worse for you than me. You've lots of things in front of you. You'll get into the 11 next year. You'll get into the 6 at Christmas if you try. You'll swagger horribly. Frank could not manage to pump up any more consoling reflections. They were all beside the point. So, like a sensible boy, he left them alone, and went to the point instead. "David, old chap," he said, "I don't believe 2 fellows ever had such a good time as we've had, and it would be rot to pretend not to be sorry that this bit of it has come to an end. I dare say we shall have splendid times together again, but there's no doubt that this is over. On the other hand, it would be equal rot not to feel jolly thankful for it. The chances were millions to 1 against our ever coming across each other at all. So buck up, as I said." David had rolled over onto his face, but at this he sat up, picking bits of dry grass out of his hair. "Yes, that's so," he said, "but it will be pretty beastly without you. I shan't find another friend like you." "You jolly well better not," interrupted Frank. David could not help laughing. "I suppose we're rather idiots about each other," he said. "I dare say, but it's too late to remedy that now. Well, David, it's a good old place, this. Look at the pitch there. What a lot of ripping hours it's given to generations of fellows, me among them. There's the roof of the house through the trees. Do you see? You can just see the end window of our dormitory. I wonder if happiness soaks into a place, so that if the famous Professor Pepper—" "Oh, Mammalian blood, said David. What's that? Oh, yes, the crime at Naseby. Same one. I wonder if you would find a lot of happiness germs all over the shop. I could do with a few, said David, with a sudden return to melancholy. No, you couldn't. You've got plenty of them, as it is. Lord, there's that rotten speech I have to make at house supper. What am I to say? Oh, usual thing. Say Adams is a good fellow, and we're all good fellows, and it's a good house, and a good school, and a good everything. Hurrah! That's about it, said Frank. Oh, there's one other thing, David. Look after Jevons a bit, will you? He's turning into rather a jolly little kid. Inky little beast, said David. All right. Again they were silent for a while. Rather a ripping verse in the Psalms this morning, said Frank at length. Was there? I wasn't attending. Well, it seemed rather applicable, I thought. For my brethren and companions' sake, I will wish thee prosperity. Just as if the other David, not you, was talking to his school. And there's chapel bell beginning. They sat still a moment longer. Then Frank rose. We must go, David, he said. Wouldn't do to be late, as it's the last time. Give me your hands, I'll pull you up. David stretched out his great brown paws, and Frank hauled him to his feet. David stood there a second still, holding. Good old Psalm, he said. End of section 18.
Section 19 of David Blaize. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. David Blaize by E. F. Benson. Chapter 14, Part 1. David was sitting in front of the fire in his housemaster's study one afternoon late in November, occasionally reading the Sporting and Dramatic, and otherwise listening with a strong inward satisfaction to the slinging of the sleet on the window panes, which, as pointed out by Lucretius, emphasizes the warm comfort of present surroundings. He had a large foot on each side of the fire just below the chimney-piece, and a large cushion at the back of his head, and no intention at all of going into the foul, cold shower bath called out of doors. What made his satisfaction the more complete was that a notice had been passed round at Hall from Gregson, the captain of the house at football, that everyone had to go out for a 3-mile run with a view to keeping in training for house matches, and it added to David's pleasure to think of all those poor wretches plodding through the rainy sleet and the mud and the puddles, while he, like the king's daughter in the Psalms, was all glorious within. Gregson, alias Plugs, who was a pal of David's, had called him by all the insulting names he could think of, when David had absolutely refused to obey orders, and the end of it had been that David had picked Gregson up. He was a little fellow, though an admirable halfback at rugby football, and carried him all the way upstairs in his arms and round each dormitory in turn to show them that he was in perfectly good training already. Thereafter he had taken the Sporting and Dramatic from the reading room, against all rules, and retired to Adams's study to spend a cozy time before the fire. Adams himself came in before long, and David pushed his chair back and took down his large feet so that he did not usurp the whole of the hearth-rug and the entire warmth of the fire. He had, like half the house, the habit of sitting in Adams's study, who wanted nothing better than to have his boys about. "Not gone for a training run, David?" asked he. "No, sir. Plugs gave me leave off." Adams lit his pipe and sat down on the hearth-rug, which was his usual place. "On what grounds?" he asked. David laughed. "I carried him round the house, sir, to show him I was in good training," he said. "He didn't mind a bit." "That'll do for my text," said Adams. "I wanted to sermonize you." "That's the sort of thing, David, that I wish you wouldn't do. You are rather given to undermining authority. Doesn't set a very good example, and though you probably don't know it, the house takes its tune from you and one or two others." You are pals with Gregson, I know, and that's all the more reason why you should support him. And while I'm on the subject, I want to ask you not to swear so much." David sat up in astonishment. "Sir, I bet you've never heard me swear," he said. "I know I haven't. But I've heard young Jevons, and I draw the perfectly correct conclusion that you do. I'm awfully grateful, by the way, for your taking him up as you've done and teaching him to wash his hands and not look as if everybody wanted to thrash him. Did anybody suggest it to you?" "Oh, yes, Frank," said David. "Well, you've done good work, though I didn't mean to praise you. But Jevons copies you. He brushes his hair like you and whistles between his teeth, or tries to, and runs instead of walking, and, as I say, swears. Do stop it, will you? He was leaning out of his study window yesterday exchanging compliments with somebody, and I never heard such an assortment of Billingsgate. It's such awfully bad form, you know. Also, the sentiments expressed by bad language are not edifying." "I'll try, sir," said David. I never thought of swearing as meaning anything." "I know you didn't. I never said it was the expression of a foul mind. But the house is becoming a perfect company of bargees. Try not to swear yourself, and kick anybody who does when it's convenient. That's all about that." "Right, sir," said David. "Then there's another thing," said Adams. "I want you to tell me about the Court of Appeal. I've only just heard about it, and I don't think I like it." David frowned. This wasn't his idea of a comfortable afternoon indoors at all, and he wished he'd gone out for a run instead of carrying plugs round the house. "I don't think I can, sir," he said. "There are other fellows concerned in it." "Oh, I know that. The court is you and Gregson and Baggs, chiefly you. That's why I asked you. I heard about it from the head. He doesn't like it either. I said I would go into the matter. I don't promise that he won't as well." "I suppose that little beast Manton told him," remarked David. "I don't agree with little beast," said Adams. "But I agree that probably Manton told him. I really don't see what else the head of the house could do. Now, I want to hear what the Court of Appeal have to say about themselves, just as I shall want to know what the prefects say about them. Gregson and Baggs are quite safe in your hands as advocatus. Well, perhaps not quite diaboli. You can trust me for that." David raised himself and sat Turk fashion with crossed legs in the big basket chair. "It's rather a long story, sir, if I'm to tell it from the beginning," he said. "Never mind." "Well, you see, sir, there was such an awful change in the house when Frank and Cruikshank left at the end of last half. You see, they were proper prefects. They used their authority properly, and it was jolly well necessary to respect it. You couldn't cheek fellows like them when they gave orders. It simply couldn't happen. And it was so frantically different to get little clever squirts like Manton and Crossley in authority instead. They couldn't keep order a hang. The whole house would have been out of hand in no time. You'll see that the Court of Appeal was really meant to preserve order. Why, the very fags used to laugh at them. One of them put soap in Manton's kettle one day, and when it boiled, it came bubbling out of the spout like blowing soap bubbles. You never saw anything so funny. But the Court of Appeal stopped that." Adams preserved his gravity. "That's rather a new light," he said. "Go on, David. You needn't bring in names if you think you'd better not, but it's only fair that the head should know your side of the question, as he's heard Manton's." David got red in the face. "Manton's a filthy little sneak," he observed. "Also, I bet he hasn't told the head the truth." "He probably told him the truth as it struck him," said Adams. "Strikes you differently. But he didn't sneak, as you think. The head got his first news about the Court of Appeal from quite another source." "May I know what source?" asked David. "Yes, I don't mind telling you, but you must be officially ignorant. Jevons went to breakfast with the head the other day and remarked in an outburst of confidence that you were far the biggest swell in the house because you were the president of the Court of Appeal. He said it in all innocence, but the head was naturally interested to hear more and applied to the proper quarter, which was Manton." David recovered from his spurt of temper. "That funny little Jev probably thought it all quite regular," he said. "Of course he did. He wouldn't have given you away on purpose. Go on. We've got to the soap in the kettle." David laughed. "Yes, sir. You should have seen it coming all rainbowy out of the spout. So, of course, Manton sent for the fella who did it, and he couldn't even cane him alone but had to have Crossley in to help. It's perfectly degrading, sir, to have prefects like that. So Crossley held the fellow down, and just as Manton began to lay on, the fella kicked out, and Crossley slipped across to get out of the way, and Manton landed him an awful wipe over the shin. And so Crossley let go and stamped about, and they made such a row between them that I had to look in. I'd gone on tiptoe to the door, sir, in case anything funny occurred. And so, as I say, I looked in, and there was Babington. Oh, the name slipped out by accident. Fit to burst himself with laughing, and the kettle boiling over again with soap bubbles, and Crossley hopping about on one leg, and Manton apologizing to him. And then Manton turned on me and told me I was undermining discipline. So I had to say there seemed a precious lot of discipline to undermine. And then Manton lost his presence of mind and whacked out again at Babington and missed him and smashed his electric light. Oh, Lord, I never saw anything so funny. David shrieked with laughter again at the remembrance, and Adams could not resist joining him as he turned to beat out his pipe against the bars of the fire. "Well," he said at length. "I could tell you heaps of stories like that," said David, wiping his eyes. "Another time it was Crossley who told a fellow to write out 50 lines. So he wrote out 50 lines, just like that, on a sheet of paper and showed it up. Fancy doing that to Frank or Crookles. Why, you couldn't. And then Crossley told him to write them out twice, so he took another bit of paper and wrote them out twice on it. And then Crossley said he would cane him, so Jevons— oh, Lord, there's another name. Please forget it, sir. Jevons came and appealed. Precious lot of good that did him, for the court were satisfied that he'd deserved his 50 lines, and so I gave him 6 frightful stingers myself, as I knew Crossley wasn't fit to, for cheek to a prefect. And yet you and Manton say I'm undermining discipline, sir," added David in a voice of outraged virtue. "Why, we're enforcing it. Jev had to write out his 100 lines and got a whacking, too. Though the Court of Appeal can reverse a prefect's decision, it also may enforce it, and then the appellant gets it twice as hot for having appealed, same as in English law, sir." "This is all rather news to me," remarked Adams. "Well, sir, something had to be done," said David, "or the whole house would have gone to pot. Why, the fags might have taken it into their heads to cheek 5th form next when they'd finished with the 6th, and then there would have been trouble. You see, most of the big fellows in the house are in the 5th. That's the way the Court of Appeal started." "Go on," said Adams. "Well, the next thing was— oh, I must tell you this. One night, a couple of juniors made an apple pie bed for Gregson. Awful cheek. So naturally, he whacked them soundly and formally, and they went to Manton and told him that Gregson had been whacking them. So round comes Manton and tells Gregson before the whole dormitory, and him captain of football, that he's no right to, as he wasn't a prefect. And of course, Gregson said he'd heard that a little before Manton had caned Crossley, that was the Babington affair, and that he hadn't any right to cane a prefect. That's the sort of thing that went on all the first weeks of this half, sir. There'd have been a regular revolution unless we'd done something. So I say the Court of Appeals is more to support authority than the other way about." "Well, now we'll take the other way about," said Adams. "I mean, I want to know about the cases in which you upset the prefect's authority." David thought for a moment. "Well, sir, those two, Manton and Crossley, did all sorts of things we're not accustomed to have prefects doing," he said. "When they went the round of the studies during preparation to see that we were working, they used to put on slippers and open the door quick to try and catch you doing nothing, and of course they often did. Well, that's not playing the game, sir. Frank always came clumping along, and he always tapped at your door. It was just the same when they went the rounds of dormitories after lights were out. Slippers. You don't do any good by spying, you know. You won't stop fellows ragging or anything else that sort of way. It only means that two can play at that game, and if you want to do anything of the kind that you shouldn't, you just put a sentinel at the door. Spying just encourages fellows to break rules. Smoking, too." "Well, smoking," said Adams. "Crossley suspected a certain fellow of smoking, and one day when he was out, he went and looked in his table drawer and found a pipe there. Now, sir, that sort of thing's all rot. He wanted to whack him for it, and the fellow appealed. So naturally, we gave it in his favor when it came out that Crossley had looked in his private drawer. You wouldn't dream of doing it yourself, sir, naturally not. So, of course, we reversed Crossley's sentence and wouldn't let him be whacked." "Did you three appoint yourself the court?" asked Adams. "Yes, I suppose it was about that. We were all pals, you see, sir, and the rest of the house seemed satisfied that we'd take a fairish view of things. And so, about a month ago, after we'd settled that something must be done, we just let everyone know that they could appeal against any impot or caning that those two, Manton and Crossley, proposed to give, and we would decide. But then, you see, sir, if anyone appeals, as I said, and the court upholds the prefect, he gets it twice as hot, 100 lines instead of 50, etc. We've written it all out in a book, Constitution of the Court of Appeal, so as to have it regular and in case we forgot." "Good gracious, it's a constitution, is it?" asked Adams. David became slightly dignified. "Yes, we thought it better to put it on an orderly footing, sir," he said, "and have everything regular so that we shouldn't contradict ourselves and do one thing one time and another. Also, the fellows know what to expect. And what's more, we see that the impots are properly done if we confirm them. Canings, too. Why, one day, Crossley caned a fellow." David began to bubble with laughter again, "and he pretended to go to sleep and snore, and when Crossley told him it was all over, he pretended to awake and said, 'Hello, morning already?' Why, it's a farce, sir. It's sheer childish. What's the use of caning a fellow if you don't jolly well hurt him? So we took that out of the prefect's hands, and the impots get properly written, and fellows get properly whacked, if it's a whacking. I don't say it increases the respect in which the house holds those two little fellows at the top, but surely it's better to have some authority than none." Adams thought this over for a while. The head had apparently been given to understand by Manton that the authority of the two prefects had been wrenched out of their hands by these large athletic upstarts of the fifth form, and that in consequence anarchy prevailed, and the house had become a sort of Medmenham Abbey. But David's account had put a perfectly different aspect on the affair, and one that was eminently reasonable. Adams was a fair-minded man, and putting aside altogether the fact that he delighted in David and disliked Manton, he believed that David's version was the true one. It had always been his plan to let the house look after its own affairs as far as possible. He gave it home rule, in fact, and certainly the transfer of government to the fifth form, though highly irregular and in defiance of school rules, he believed to have been distinctly for the good of the nation. Again, a thing which bore out this view. The first weeks of the half had been full of trouble and worry. Small boys were forever appealing to him against the prefects, and prefects were as constantly invoking his authority to endorse their own lack of it. Then, about a month ago, all these disturbances had ceased, and Adams, with his habitual optimism, had supposed that the house had shaken down together now. But in the light of all this, it seemed far more reasonable to suppose that the remedy had been brought about by this brigandage of authority. Certainly the restoration of peace and quiet was coincident with the establishment of this impertinent Court of Appeal, which would have to come to an end as a recognized institution. But during its existence, it seemed to have been effective. "Do you reverse many of the prefect's rulings?" asked Adams. "Oh, no, sir, not now," said David, anxious to do such justice as could be done to those two impotent figureheads. "You see, neither of them liked their silly rulings reversed, and they've become much more sensible. But you simply can't have a prefect looking in your study when you're out and wanting to cane you because he finds a pipe there. Fancy Frank or Cruikshank doing a scruggish low-down trick like that." "You seem rather fond of that instance," said Adams. "Yes, sir, because it's so jolly typical," said David. Adams got up. "I'm considering what to say to the head," he remarked. "I shall certainly tell him there's another side to the question beside Manton's." "Oh, ripping," said David cordially. "I felt sure you'd see it." "I suppose you enjoyed the Court of Appeal a good deal?" he asked. "Rather, sir," said David. "I should think we did. Wish you could have heard one of the trials, with us three on the bench, and Manton as defendant and some junior as plaintiff. You see, sir, Manton and Crossley consented to it all. That's another point in our favor, isn't it? Gregson planned all the ritual, because his pater's a real judge in appeal courts, and we call each other my learned brother Crabtree, or Blaize, for of course there are no nicknames or Christian names in court. It's all quite serious. There's no rag about it. We were thinking of appointing a permanent counsel to plead for plaintiffs." Adams laughed. "David, you don't suppose that the Court of Appeal is going to be allowed to remain in existence?" he asked. "That's as you wish, sir," he said. "But—" "Well?" asked Adams. "Nothing, sir. I was only thinking that they'll be rather rows again." "I hope not," said Adams. "That's exactly what you and fellows like you have got to prevent." "But how can we if you're going to stop it?" asked David. "In hundreds of ways. By backing the prefects up without overriding them. You're sensible enough to know that." David considered this. "Is the head sick about it, sir?" he asked. "He's never sick about anything till he's in full possession of the facts. He was prepared to be uncommonly sick when he had only heard the other side. In fact, he said something about giving you another lesson with regard to obeying authorities. But after what you've told me, I don't think you need be alarmed." "Oh, I'm not," said David. "Of course you'll see there's another side to it, same as you've done. Something had to happen when we got Manton and Crossley instead of Frank and Cruikshank." At this moment, a small and completely soaked boy burst into the room, not seeing Adams, who was sitting behind the door, but only David. "Letter for you, Blaize," he said. "Oh, and I want to appeal. Sorry, sir, I didn't see you." "You do now, Jevons," said Adams. "So go on, tell Blaize what the appeal's about." "Well, sir, somebody put my sponge on the top of Manton's door, made a booby trap, and because it's my sponge, he says I'm responsible unless I find out who put it there." Adams nodded to David. "Go on, learned brother Blaize," he said. "Notice in writing, Jev," he said. He had seen the handwriting of his letter and tore it open. "Oh, I say, how ripping," he said. "Frank's mother's ill and is ordered out of England for Christmas. Well, at least it's beastly that she's ill. But Frank wants to know if he can stay with us for a week. I say, Jev, you're awfully wet, aren't you? I mean, you couldn't get much wetter. So I wonder if you'd take a tellywag just down to the office." "Rather. And I'll put my appeal in your study, shall I?" "Yes." "Right. I'll be back in a second if you'll have your tellywag ready." "Is the telegram to Frank saying he can come?" asked Adams. "Yes, sir." "Then hadn't you better write to your father first? It might not be convenient." The impulsive David had already written, "Ripping, stay as long as you can." But he paused. "Oh, well, I suppose it would be best, sir," he said. "I wish you hadn't thought of it." David got up to go to his study and write the note which was so far outstripped by his desire. "And may I talk to Bags and Plugs about the Court of Appeal, sir?" he said. "Certainly. You can talk it over with Manton, too, if you like. In fact, I rather recommend it." Adam's recommendation seemed to be rather sensible when David thought it over, though not, perhaps, strictly in accordance with Adam's idea in suggesting it. It would give the court an opportunity, perhaps, of finding out what Manton had said to the head, and, should Manton not choose to tell them, it was easy to threaten as a counter-move that the court, when called upon, as it undoubtedly would be, to appear before the head, would give a highly colored account strictly based upon facts of what had led to its formation. Also, they could put before Manton and Crossley a very depressing picture of what their position would be if the court was dissolved, and privately chose not to back up their restored authority. It required but small imagination to picture the status of those two unfortunate prefects if they had to enforce discipline in the house without the support of what had been the court. End of section 19, read by Tracy Coffey, Springfield, June 17th, 2024. Section 20 of David Blaize. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. David Blaize by E.F. Benson. Chapter 14, Part 2. Baggs and Gregson had just come in from their run, and Gregson, being in his bath and in the superior position of having no clothes on, could take reprisals by water on David's having refused to go out. David, in fact, had to dodge a soaking sponge thrown at him before he had time to explain. "Oh, pax a minute," he said. "There's an awful serious thing happened, Plugs. The head knows all about the Court of Appeal, and it's going to be gone into." "Rot," said Gregson, filling his sponge again. "Now who wouldn't go out for a sweat, David?" "'Tisn't rot," shrieked David, snatching up a towel to shield himself. "I swear it isn't. While you brutes have been having an innocent, happy sweat along the road this nice weather, I've been jawed by Adams. It's a solid fact. We're all going to be hauled up before the head, and he was disposed to be uncommonly sick about it, so Adams said. Do shut up being funny with sponges." "Righto," said Plugs, "if you swear you're not lying." "Swear," said David. "Hurry up and dress and come to my study because you and I and Baggs have to talk. It's a welter of politics." The court accordingly met in about 10 minutes' time in David's study, where he had made tea for them, and where on the table lay Jevons's appeal. He laid before the other two all his talk with Adams, reproducing it with laudable accuracy. "And, as it's dead cert that we shall appear before the head," he finished up, "we've got to agree exactly what we say. We mustn't give different accounts of it." Baggs caressed what he hoped was going to be a mustache. "Of course not," he said. "We've just got to say what's happened, truth, whole truth, and nothing but." "Oh, I didn't mean we were to make things up," said David. "But the only question is how much we tell the head. I vote for a conference. Adams suggested it, with Manton and Crossley. See if we can't let each other down easily." "Compromise out of court?" suggested Plugs. "Yes, something of the kind. We can give them away hopelessly by saying how inefficient they were, and they can give us away by saying that we've undermined the prefect's authority. Don't you see it might all be toned down a bit?" "That's no use," said Baggs, "if Manton's given us away already." "But that's just what we don't know," said David. "I vote we try to get Manton to tell us what he told the head. He may not have told him much. He may have said it was an amicable sort of arrangement. On the other hand, he may have told him that our object was to undermine prefect's authority. Well, as I told Adams, there's another side to that. We generally supported it, except when it was manifestly unfair. I want to know what Manton told him. That we've put ourselves above prefects is true, but we did it in the cause of order, though of course we all enjoyed it frightfully." "And the house accepted us," said Baggs. "Lot the head will care for that. I want to get Manton and Crossley to come and talk. Crossley doesn't matter, but Manton anyhow, as he's already seen the head. You see, when the head has us up, we can tell him a lot, if we choose. He'll ask us for our account of it. Manton will see that. He isn't a fool, though he is such a squirt." With Plugs as well as Bags, David was the mastermind, and after a few minutes Bags went to Manton's study and quite politely asked him to come round and confer with the court. Manton rather liked this. He promised himself a pleasant time in telling the court that the head was going into the whole matter himself and that he had nothing more to do with it. He was prepared to be maliciously civil and courteous, and to express his regret the court had made such an ass of itself as its spontaneous generation implied. He thought it would be rather fun, and came very blandly with his spectacles on and a book that he was reading. His finger kept his place in a cursory manner. "Here I am," he said. "Hello, Blaize. Hello, Gregson. Yes, the Court of Appeal. It wasn't I who went to the head about it, you know. It was that little fellow, Blaize's friend, who let it out. What's his name? I forget." "Oh, Jevons," said David. "Yes, Jevons told the head about it. And so, of course, the head asked me more. He put it rather nicely. He said it was my business to tell him about it as head of the house." David was seated between his two learned brothers, just as if a regular court was going on. "Oh, we know about Jevons," he said. "We can leave Jevons out." "Waive," said Plugs formally. "Yes, we can waive Jevons," said David, "as my learned brother suggests." Manton gave a little cackle of laughter. "I shouldn't wonder if you have to waive everything," he observed pleasantly. "Oh, we're not going to waive you just yet, if you count for anything," retorted David, "but perhaps you don't count for much." Bags suddenly laughed in a hoarse manner. "I beg pardon, Brother Blaize," he said. "Right-o, Brother Crabtree, but just contain yourself." "Well, Manton, you've been to the head with your version, and next we go to the head with ours. We can make it pretty sultry for you if we choose, and we shouldn't mind doing it a bit. But it all depends on what you have told the head. That's what we should like to know." Manton still felt in a very superior position. All he had told the head was quite true, namely that these 3 fifth-form boys put themselves in a position above the prefects, so that any order or punishment by the 2 sixth-form boys in the house could be appealed against, and if they thought proper, could be reversed. The head had been extremely grave about it, and at present there was no doubt in Manton's mind that he was going to uphold the authority of the prefects in a summary manner, and probably make it very hot for those who had set themselves above it. He felt quite secure and comfortable, and smiled in a rather lofty manner. "I dare say the head will tell you as much of what I said as he thinks good for you," he observed. "But I really don't see why I should. You see, he takes the view that prefects are not to be dictated to by 2 or 3 members of the 5th form. Bad precedent, you know. Might lead to a couple of fellows out of the 4th form dictating to you. Jevons and a friend might make a super court of appeal. Rather funny that would be." David passed the ghost of a wink to Gregson. He wanted to draw Manton on a little further before he unmasked his batteries. It required some control to assume an attitude of humility when delicious sentences were beginning to seethe in his brain. But it was heavenly to see Manton's malicious little eyes beaming at him through his spectacles, and notice what an awful scug he looked with his hair rather long behind, lying outside his collar. He gave a sigh. "I say, I'm afraid we're in for it," he said disconsolately. Manton let his mouth expand into an odious smile. "Yes, I should say you were," he observed. "You see, the head's view is that the authority of prefects is an institution which has his support, and he doesn't quite see why it should be taken away by 3 fellows in the 5th. He asked me all sorts of questions, and so I had to give him a pretty full account. I should make a clean breast of it, I think, if I were you." David could stand this no longer. He felt that he must burst if he had to listen to any more of Manton's advice. "You say you gave him a pretty full account," he said, "though you've not chosen to tell us what it was. Well, I shouldn't wonder if we made it a bit fuller for you. I beg your pardon, Brother Crabtree?" Bags was leaning back, looking dreamily at Manton. "Learned Brother Gregson," he observed, "do you remember one day how Mr. Manton wanted to whack a little boy called Babington, and how he had to call in Mr. Crossley to help?" Pluggs assumed a portentous air. "Yes, Brother Crabtree," he said, "and how soap bubbles came out of Mr. Manton's kettle, though he had not meant to wash." David chimed in. "And we all remember, my learned brother," he said, "how the house was a perfect bear garden for the first month of this term before we started our worshipful court, and how—" David turned to Manton. "Perhaps you didn't tell the head that," he said. "We shall. We shall tell him how you couldn't get lines done for you, till we enforced the authority you hadn't got. We shall say how you walk round the house in slippers, and when you get back to your own fuggy studies, you daren't walk straight in for fear of finding a booby trap come down on your mangy heads. Jolly wise precaution, too, on your part. We shall tell the head all that." David licked his lips as he warmed to his work. He took Jevons's appeal off the table in front of him. "I shall take this to the head and read it him," he said. "Just listen. Pretty dignified position for you, isn't it? To the Court of Appeal. Please, Blaize, Manton got an awful soaker because somebody else put my sponge on the top of his door, which soused him, and because it was my sponge, he says he'll whack me, unless I find out who did it and tell him, which isn't fair because it's not my business. So I appeal. M.C. Jevons." Manton was getting a little rattled. Otherwise, he would not have done anything so foolish as to try to grab this paper. David whisked it away. "I shall say, too, that you tried to get hold of this," he said. "Better sit down, Manton." "That's right. And I shall tell him that your notion of authority is to look in a fellow's private drawer when he's out to see if you can nail a pipe." "I never did," said Manton wildly. "That was Crossley." "Oh, then I suppose Crossley will explain that," said David. "Of course, it may all be stale news to the head, since you gave him a pretty full account, but I'll just see if the head happened to listen to that part. You see, we don't in the least mind telling you what we're going to say to the head, though you're too superior to tell us what you said. I've told Adams about it already, and he thinks you're an awfully good prefect, of course. And then, you see," concluded David cheerfully, "when we've told him all that really happened, why shouldn't we make up a lot that didn't? Probably you did the same. Gosh, the head will have a wonderful high opinion of you before I've done. I shouldn't wonder if it isn't more than he can bear, and jolly well breaks down and sobs and kneels and gives thanks that he has such a ripping couple of prefects in this house to keep us all in order." "Well, you needn't be sarcastic about it," said Manton. "Yes, I need, because you began about having a fourth form court of appeal to override us. You think that it's only you who could be so damn sarcastic and superior and give any garbled account you like to the head? It wasn't garbled." "It must have been. Or do you suppose that a sensible chap like the head could have taken your side?" "Perhaps you didn't invent things, but I swear you left out some jolly important ones, like your not being able to cane a cheeky junior without getting Crossley to help you, and then whacking him on the shin instead. You should have seen Adam shaking when I told him about it, and I bet you said we set ourselves in opposition to you. That's a lie. We backed your authority up, except when you made such utter squirts of yourselves that we couldn't. We helped you, you goat. We did for you what you couldn't do for yourselves. Lord, it makes me hot to talk to a chap like you. Go on, Brother Crabtree." Manton was beginning to present so ludicrous an appearance that learned Brother Blaize could hardly prevent bubbling with laughter, which would have spoiled the forcibleness of the situation. His finger no longer kept his place in his book. His tight little mouth no longer complacently smiled, but had fallen open in dismay at David's surprising remarks, and learned Brother Crabtree, with his suave style and slow sentences, did not reassure him. "You see, there's nothing like fair play, Manton," said Baggs. "I take it that you agree. And as you've had an uninterrupted innings with the head, and have run up a good score against us, I'm sure it is only proper that we should have our turn. Now, you were not wise in refusing to tell us what you had said to the head, but the time for that is past now, and even if you wanted to, I don't suppose we would listen to you. It was foolish of you, because you make us guess what it was, and naturally, we guess that you made up a lot of lies, since we think that is the sort of thing you would do. So, when you leave us now, which will be very soon, we shall make up some rippers about you and Crossley. Really awful things, you know. I began making some up when Brother Blaize was addressing you. They are beauties. Gregson took up the tale with a wink at David in the eye away from Manton. And yet, I don't know that we need bother to make things up, Brother Crabtree, he said. It's easier to say just a few of the things that really happened. We will tell the head the sort of thing that goes on in Manton's study when he thinks all the house are at preparation. Now Manton, for all his feebleness and ineffectiveness as a prefect, was as blameless as the Ethiopian. But I don't know what you mean, he said. Gregson gave a little laugh, which he transformed into a cough. Oh, really, he said. But the head will soon know what we mean. Brother Blaize, knows. David had caught the wink correctly. He put on a scornful face. Oh, that? He said. Yes, disgusting. You should be more careful about shutting your door, Manton. I and Gregson were walking about the house in slippers, following the example of the sixth form. But I don't know what you're talking about, said Manton. Righto, we won't talk about it anymore. To you. It was in vain that Manton assured himself that, as was perfectly true, his conscience was as clear as noonday, for this wicked and subtly acted fraud on the part of those fifth-form devils made him uncomfortable in spite of himself. And though he had not told the head anything false about this beastly court of appeal, he certainly had not put their side of the case before him with the directness that now appeared they were going to do on their own behalf. He had not, for instance, said the court of appeal propped up, endorsed, supported the authority of himself and Crossley far more than they overrode it, though it was perfectly true, as he had told the head, that they arrogated the supreme authority to themselves. Nor had it occurred to him to tell the head that he and Crossley were quite incompetent to maintain discipline, that they got ragged to the point of having soap put in their kettles, that they toured the house in slippers. Truly, the supplement to his tale was likely to be as voluminous as the tale itself. Then David rose. Well, I don't think we need detain you, he said politely. In fact, we've got a good deal to talk over among ourselves. Thanks awfully for coming. I expect we shall all meet again at the heads. That's all, then. But Manton was not quite sure that this was all. Various remarks by one or other of the members of the court were beginning to cause him somewhat acute internal questionings. In especial, he disliked the fact that Adams was in possession of the court side of the case, and, as like as not, would give the head the benefit of it. Perhaps we might discuss it all a little more, he said, with a faint air of condescension still lingering about him. I can, go to the head, because he told me that if I had anything more to tell him, I was to. I might say, I really should be quite glad to, that Crossley and I didn't want to get you into trouble. Oh, that's all right, said David cheerfully. Don't bother about that. You've got us into no trouble at all. I expect we shall come out perfectly right. But the head was awfully sick about it, said Manton. He laid a good deal of stress on the fact that you did set yourselves up as an authority superior to the prefects. I expect I'll make that all square, said David. I dare say I shall put our case as strongly as you put yours. Adams will have done the same too, I'm pretty sure. Of course, we thought we might let you down more easily if you told us what you told the head, and after all, we gave you an opportunity of doing so, but you didn't take it, so that's finished. Well, I think perhaps I was wrong not to tell you, said Manton. I'm sure you were, assented Baggs warmly. Isn't it an awful pity one doesn't think of that sort of thing sooner? "And so if you like, I'll tell you now," said Manton, finishing his sentence. "Oh, we don't care a hang either way," said David. "If you wish, you may tell us, but it'll be because you ask us if you may. We don't want to hear it." "But I thought you asked me to," said this dismal prefect. "We did, but it's no use to us now. We've made up our minds what to do." "Well, shall I tell the head that you did often support the authority of the Sixth? It might make him less sick with you." "Rubbish," said Gregson. "You're proposing these things now simply because you want us not to tell the head our side of it. Is that the reason or not?" "I think it would—" "Yes or no?" said Brother Blaize in a terrible voice. "Yes." "Why not have asked for mercy sooner then, instead of giving yourself all these airs? Get on." It was a very unstuffed Manton who was left at the end of this recital, for though he had not told the head anything palpably false, yet the picture the head must have drawn of the whole affair was about as erroneous as it could possibly be. He had let the head assume that the authority of the prefects over the house was complete and satisfactory, until the Court of Appeal set itself up, and he had certainly not said that the court in most cases endorsed their authority and saw that their orders were obeyed. All this was drawn from him by cool and ruthless questioning. At the end, David gave a long whistle. "Well, 'pon my word, you are in a mess," he said. "I'm not at all sure that I shouldn't resign my prefectship if I were you before the head kicked me out. You are the deuce of a hand at suppressio veri. Ain't that it, Brother Gregson? Why, there isn't an ounce of truth that you haven't suppressed, and it's all as full of suggestio... falsi, said Baggs. "Yes, suggestio falsi as can stick. The best thing you can do is to go and talk it over with Crossley and then come back and tell us what you propose to tell the head. If you don't make a clean breast of it to him and let him see that he's only got a garbled, yes, I said garbled, version of it at present, you may be sure we shall. And when you've made up your minds, come back and tell us. Tap at the door first." The unstuffed Manton rose. "Yes, I'll do that," he said. Thanks." The door closed behind him, and David, who was growing extremely red in the face with suppressio rhesus, turned over and buried his face in the sofa cushions, kicking wildly in the air. The other learned brethren stifled themselves lest Manton should hear them, and for a few minutes the Court of Appeal writhed in the agonies of silent mirth. "Oh, Lord," said David at length, "I didn't know there was such richness in the world. To think that half an hour ago that little squirt thought he had us on toast. Toast's there, all right, but 'tisn't we who are on it. And now he's making up another version, which is ours, and wanting to know if that'll satisfy us for him to go to the head with. Oh, Lord!" "Too much mercy to let him," said Baggs. "Not a bit of it. It's much more effective if Manton puts our side of it to the head." "But what if he doesn't tell the head all he says he's going to?" asked Pluggs. "He must. The only way he can save his face is by going to him at once before Adams can. Oh, there's toast enough. Besides, when the head sees us, we can soon tell if Manton's given him the correct version." David, as president of the court, was summoned to the Supreme Presence next day. "I've been into the question of the Court of Appeal," said the head, "and what Manton told me last night puts a different complexion on it from what I had heard before. Of course, the court must be dissolved at once, Blaize. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." A faint smile spread over the head's face as he looked at the big jolly boy. "And tell your learned brethren," he said, "what I say. The authorities in your house are Mr. Adams and the prefects, and there are no other authorities. But I believe now that on the whole the court meant well, and I'm quite certain it enjoyed itself immensely. That particular enjoyment, I'm afraid, must cease, but I want it, the court that is, to continue meaning well in a private capacity. and to support the prefect's authority, though it may no longer enforce or reverse their orders. And Blaize, this is for your private ear alone. I think the court probably did very useful work. But we mustn't have any more courts. That's all then. How are you getting on? Well, I hope, and Mr. Adams seems to think so. Heard anything from your friend Maddox lately? Gosh, what a brick, David said to himself as he went out. End of section 20. Read by Tracy Coffey, Springfield, June 17th, 2024.
Section 21 of David Blaize. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. David Blaize by E.F. Benson. Chapter 15. David was lying on his back under the big elm tree near the cricket pavilion one Sunday afternoon in mid-June. By him, upright and attentive, sat the faithful Baggs, listening and occasionally playing the part of Greek chorus, that is to say, putting in short, appropriate reflections, to a quantity of surprising information. Both boys wore the white tie characteristic of prefects on Sunday, for both had got their promotion into the lower sixth at Easter, and were colleagues of the inefficient Manton and Crossley. These two young gentlemen, it may be remarked, were vastly relieved to have the burden of authority taken off their somewhat feeble shoulders, and David and Baggs, particularly David, ruled the house with genial exuberance, and, when necessary, a rod of iron. Just now both the iron and the exuberance were relaxed, and David lay there in an abandonment of physical laziness. His straw hat, with crooked 11 colors, was tilted over the top part of his face, so as to shield his eyes from the speckles and sparkles of sun that filtered through the canopy of leaves above him, and his mouth and chin alone were visible. His long legs were stretched out in front of him, showing a white hiatus between a despondent sock and the end of his trousers, and a persistent fly kept settling there, an attention which he acknowledged by dabbing at it with the other ankle. "'Tisn't as if I was a little boy any longer," he said. "When a fellow is close on 17, as you and I are, it's time he began to realize that he's grown up. Why, my mother was only 17 when she married." "But do you propose to marry at 17?" asked Baggs, with sarcastic allusion to the conversation that had gone before. "Where'll she live? She can't very well sleep in dormitory." David gave a little spurt of laughter, and the sun shone on his white teeth and down his red throat, but he quickly became grave again. "Is that funny?" he said. "If so, I suppose I'd better laugh, though I wish I saw the point. Who said I was going to marry? Oh gosh, what a clipper she is!" "And it's not much more than a fortnight ago that you thought all girls were rotten," said Baggs. "More fool me, then, and more fool you for still thinking so. Lord, I wish I was really grown up, quite old, I mean 19 or 20. I say, do you think she looked at me at all in chapel this morning?" "I don't think so," said Baggs cheerily, "and I was watching her pretty nearly all the time, as I knew you would ask." "Oh, yes, she did once, when you began to sing Amen before it was time, but she looked away again at once." "Ha, ha," said David in a dry speaking voice, not laughing at all. "Well, she's bound to come to the old boy's match, isn't she? And I don't see how she can help noticing if I take any wickets." "Nor if you get constantly hit out of the ground," said Baggs. David found he agreed with this. "You're a jolly sympathetic sort of pal," he said at length. Baggs had a certain defense. "Well, it seems so queer of you," he said. "It's rot if you're going to think about and talk about nothing else than a female girl. Besides, she must be frightfully old. I shouldn't wonder if she was 20. Why, your mother had been married 3 years when she was as old as that." "Yes, and had 2 children, and had also died," said David, rather embarrassingly. "Oh, sorry, I didn't know," said Baggs. "But about your girl now," he went on, hurriedly. "How do you know she isn't engaged already? She easily might be. She's awfully pretty. I grant you that. least I suppose she is, though both you and I used to think that all girls looked exactly alike." "Idiots! Idiots we were," said David, kicking wildly in the air. "And what are you going to do?" continued Baggs, who always saw the practical issues. "Are you going to tell her how frightfully keen you are on her?" "I expect she guesses," said David solemnly. "She came to tea with me twice in my study. It's rather marked for a fellow to ask a Don's daughter to tea twice in the same half, especially if she comes the first time." "Well, but you didn't say anything sweet and moonlightly to her," said Baggs. "You talked about nothing but cricket. Besides, Pluggs and I were there the whole time, and so was Mother Gray." David drew a long breath, and stretched his arms and legs out in the form of one crucified till elbows and knees were taut. "Violet Gray," he said, dwelling on the syllables. "Did you ever hear such a jolly name? And it's just like her. It's a slim, honey-colored hair name." Baggs groaned slightly. It really was appalling for David to be in this deplorable state. "Violet Gray," he said, in a business-like manner. Violet Gray. I think it sounds better than Violet Blaize." David sat up. "Baggs, you don't understand one single thing about it," he said. "How can I explain? She's just the most wonderful and beautiful thing that ever happened. I wonder if Frank will understand. I shall tell him, but nobody else. He's coming down end of next week." "He'll probably cut you out," said Baggs, who thought a bracing treatment was best for his idiotic friend. "Not he. We're pals. Of course he could if he wanted, since any girl would fall in love with Frank straight off, if he held up his little finger. Jove, I'd give anything to see the varsity cricket match this week. And to think that in final house match last year I was in at one end and a Cambridge cricket blue the other." "Well, that happened to everybody else in the House 11, said Baggs, "since Maddox went in first and carried his bat." David laughed. "So it did," he said. "I'll back you against anyone in the world, Baggs, for bald literal prosaicness. You haven't got an ounce of imagination. You see things just exactly as they happen. You've less of romance than a horse roller," he said, looking round for inspiration, and seeing that useful article with its shafts in the air. "Perhaps I have, perhaps I haven't," said Baggs, "but it's perfectly true. I don't jaw about it." "Never mind that. Look here, supposing you might either kiss Violet Gray twice, we'll say, or see the Oxford and Cambridge match. Which would you choose?" "Depends on the match," said David. "Of course, if Frank was going to make a century, and I were to see him do that, I don't know what else I could choose. Oh, Lord, but fancy kissing her, though. I wish you wouldn't ask such stumpers. But that's you all over. You want me to be practical and say which I should like best, but I just can't. I feel like a dog who is being whistled to from opposite directions by two fellows he loves. Doesn't know which way to go." Baggs sniffed scornfully. "Oh, you've not got it so desperately if you only feel like that," he said. David shut his eyes and made his mouth tight with an air of martyr-like determination. "I should choose kissing her," he said, "because Frank could tell me all about the match afterwards, and besides it would all be reported in the Sportsman, and I could read about it. But I couldn't read about my kissing her in the paper. At least I don't know in which. Oh, Lord, but fancy seeing David putting perfectly straight balls away to the leg boundary in the varsity match, and then scratching his ear, as he always does when he hits a boundary, as if wondering what on earth has happened to the ball. I don't know which I should choose. I don't know." David looked mournfully round for inspiration, and lay down again. "After all, I wonder whether it's worth while doing anything or getting anything," he said with a sudden lugubrious accent. "I tried to think it would be a damned fine, jolly fine thing to get into the 6th, and yet before a month was out we both got absolutely accustomed to it. It's been just the same about getting into school 11. Oh, well, not quite, because I do enjoy that most awfully still. I dare say it won't last. Why, a year ago, if I had been told that I might have any two things I wanted, I should have chosen to get into the 6th than the 11th. It didn't seem that there was anything more to want." "I should have thought you would have chosen that Maddox shouldn't leave," remarked Baggs. "No use wishing that. He had to. Besides, if he hadn't, he wouldn't be in the Cambridge 11 now, and you can't choose anything that clips your pal's wings." 'Tisn't my expression. Adam said it the other day when he was talking to me about Jev." "Didn't know Jevons had any wings," said Baggs. "Nor did I, but Adams seems to think so. I say, Adams is a rather wise sort of man, and he sees just about 3 times as much as I thought. Oh, and he told me Hughes had passed into Sandhurst. He must have become a decent chap again." "They do," said Baggs. "Jolly glad. About Adams, I always imagined that as long as he wasn't bothered, he didn't mind much what happened, short of a public row. But I believe his funny old eye is on us more than we think." "And much more than it used to be," said Baggs. "You know, the biz about the Court of Appeal woke him up tremendous. There was a regular Insta and Constitution going on in the House under his very nose, and he had never suspected it. Up till then he didn't bother about what anyone else did as long as there wasn't a row. You know, David, the House was a perfect hell about the time you and I came here, and Adams hadn't a notion of it." David sat up quickly. "I dare say," he said, "but Frank kept all that away from me. Anyhow, the house is pretty well all right now. There's nothing to make a row, no smoking, no cribbing, no filth. It's ever so much more cheery to be like that. And just think that less than 3 years ago, Baggs, you and I were just beginning as 2 dirty little fags. What a bag of tricks has happened since then." "What were we talking about?" "Oh, Jevons. Adams was awfully decent to me about it. Made me blush. He said I'd taught Jev to be clean. That's true. When he first used to fag for Frank, I wanted to wash the teacups again when his filthy little paws had touched them. And oh yes, he said I'd cured him of swearing, which perhaps was true also, though it seemed rather bad luck on him to be whacked by me for swearing, when, as Adam said, he'd picked it up from me. So I had to cure myself as well, which I've almost done. But then I couldn't whack myself when I swore, so Jev got on quicker than I did." "You're not getting on much now," remarked Baggs, patiently listening. "Yes, I am. Shut up. I'm just coming to the wings. Adam said I was fussing over him too much, and tying a string to his leg, and clipping his wings, when it was time for him to fly about as he damn pleased. Lord, Jev would have got whacked for that. But you see, he's turning out rather a fetching kid. Good looking, you know, and all that, and I'm not going to have him taken up by some brute and spoiled. However, anyone who tries will have a nasty time with me first. But I suppose Adams is right. Jev's got to begin looking after himself. I'm rather sorry in a way, though. It's good sport looking after a kid like that, seeing it doesn't come to any harm. He's an affectionate little beggar, too, and I believe he knows it would make me pretty sick if he got into beastly ways. I say, I'm afraid I'm talking like a missionary." "On the plains of Timbuktu," remarked Baggs. "Yes, anywhere. Rum fellow you are, Baggs. You let me jaw to any extent without yawning or telling me to shut up. But there are such a lot of frightfully interesting things that you must talk about in order to find out what you really think. Jev, for instance. I had no idea that I was a missionary till I began to jaw. By the way, my father's coming down for the old boys' match next week. Do you remember that awful morning when he bowled into the wrong net at Helmsworth, and how ashamed I was? Funny how one changes. I should just love it if he did it again now, because it's so jolly sporty of him to try to bowl at all. My sister's coming, too, and of course Frank will be here playing for the old boys. What a family! They all love Frank at home. He and my father are tremendous pals. They talk about Norman and perpendicular and transitional till all's blue. He stayed with us most of the Christmas holidays, you know, when his mother was abroad." David sat up again. "Lord, what a lot of things there are," he said appreciatively. "Not to mention her," said Baggs. "No. Oh, by the way, I saw her coming out of Madden's, the photographer's, the other day. Do you suppose she'd been done? By Jove, shouldn't I like one?" "Well, ask her then," said Baggs with infinite patience. David knitted his forehead into a diplomatic frown. "I couldn't straight off like that," he said, "but I might lead up to it. I might say I thought Madden took jolly good photographs, and see what she said." "Suppose she said that she thought he didn't," said Baggs wearily. "Well, I could say that no one could do justice to some people. Or is that laying it on rather thick? Oh, by the way, I've been devilish cunning. The head told me that my last iambics were pretty rotten, and that I'd better have some private tuition. So I asked if I might see old Gray for it. Jolly smart, that. So I'm going to drop French and have private, too, with Gray, beginning tomorrow." "Come into the garden, Maud," remarked Baggs. "What's Maud got? Oh, I see, you mean Violet. Yes, that's the idea. Going in and out of the house, I'm sure to run across her. See? Why, it's striking 4. Let's go down to the house." David, as is the way of boys rising 17, had been growing tremendously these last 6 months, not in physical ways only, but in stature of the mind. It was impossible to imagine a boy less of a prig than he, or one so unweighted with a sense of duty or responsibility. But with his growth he had taken up his responsibilities quite simply and unconsciously and eagerly, without having any egoism about it. He did not, in fact, do these things and behave in a manner that made him so breezy a treasure to his housemaster, because he heavily realized that there were things he ought to do and a manner in which he ought to behave, but because he obeyed unconsciously the bent of his natural instincts, which were those of a very high-spirited and excellent fellow, now budding from boyhood into early manhood. He had no private meditations at all on the subject, but merely lived in active and wholesome ways, and enjoyed himself immensely. And if by any chance he had come to learn what Adams really thought of him, he would have had no doubt that his informant was just pulling his leg. His genial unconsciousness that he had any influence at all was exactly that which made his influence so strong. He had the admirable gift of not thinking about himself, but purely about the large quantity of attractive affairs that made up life, and the number of jolly chaps with whom he was associated. He had even been known to admit that Manton and Crossley, to counteract whose ridiculous ineffectiveness the Court of Appeals had been founded, were decent enough, though of course no earthly good as prefects. In the same way it was from no sense of conscious duty that he had educated and still watched over Jevons. It was sport looking after a kid. It was exactly the true account of the trouble he had taken. Then part of his growth had come this violent adoration of Violet Gray, as natural as the strutting of the young male bird, when at first it is conscious of another sex than his. David had suddenly perceived that though in many things girls are rotters, there was something about them that made it necessary to wear buttonholes, and, if possible, make runs or take wickets for other reasons than those generally necessary. The two boys strolled on Sunday pace down over the hot, sunny field, which wore its air of sabbatical and empty leisure. May had been a wet month, and the grass still retained the varnished freshness of spring, except where in patches it had been worn by pitches or practice nets. But for the last fortnight no rain had fallen, and the light soil, quick to dry, was beginning to get hard and give bowlers such as David the crumbling wickets in which his soul delighted. Adam's house had scraped through the first ties of house matches, but although David, on whom they relied to thwart and discomfit their opponents, had proved on that occasion to be extremely expensive and quite useless as a bowler, he had, in some weird fashion of his own, managed to make 50 of the most awful runs ever scored, chiefly by amazing miss-hits over the heads of point and slips. He had also been badly missed over the first ball he received, which added humour to the performance. And a little later his leg stump had been smartly hit, though without displacing the bails. He had hailed this with a shriek of laughter. But in the second tie, played last week, he had shown himself in truer colours, and had bowled fair and square in both innings without scoring at all, but had done things with a ball that really seemed inspired by Satan. He had grown into a bowler of the googliest type, and had discovered, all for himself, that if he let his shirt-sleeve wave in the air, instead of rolling it tight up round his elbow, it presented a much more puzzling outline to the batsman. On that day there had been, too, a high crosswind, and all that most of the batsmen who were favoured with his deliveries knew was that from very far off an immense lanky figure came prancing in a curved run-up to the wickets, and that from somewhere at the end of clothes hung up to dry, a quavering object that was supposed to be a cricket ball skidded through the air in such a manner that it was really impossible to tell what it was doing or what it would do. Sometimes, when it looked most charged with incalculable waywardness, it did nothing but bounce as an innocent and rotund ball should. At other times, chiefly when it looked almost pathetically guileless, It played the lowest tricks that the laws of spin permitted. It kicked out like a horse when it pitched, or it leaped nervously aside as if trying to avoid the bat. In fact, the odds were that it did precisely what you didn't expect. Or again, the demoniac Blaize would run up to the wickets with less than his usual prance, but in a slow and thoughtful manner, as if he had a headache. But if the wary batsman imagined, as he not unfrequently did, that this was the prelude to a slow and thoughtful ball, he occasionally, though not always, found he was quite in error. An extremely fast and straight ball was all that the thoughtful manner meant, whereby we learned the danger of trusting to appearances. And what made these antics the more flustering and annoying was that David, with guileless sincerity, frankly confessed that he was often by no means clear himself what the ball was going to do. "I always mean it to do something rum," he said, "but of course it doesn't always come off. And sometimes it does, just the opposite. That's such awful fun. It's all silly tosh, my bowling, you know. Comes off in house matches sometimes, but any school team would hit me over the moon." This perfectly sincere view of his own performance was not shared by Humphreys, the captain of the school 11, who had twice been one of David's victims, and to whom this opinion was expressed. "But the one you bowled me with in the first innings," said the much-injured young man, "came round my legs and took the middle stump. Blast you! Didn't you mean that?" David put his head on one side, considering. "Yes, I think I did," he said. "It was rather a good ball for me. I thought it might do something of the sort. Everyone gets a good ball in sometimes if they go on long enough." "Well, I wish you would keep them for school matches," said Humphreys. "In second innings you had me with a roaring full pitch, 95 miles an hour. I thought it was only 85, and so I missed it by 10 miles. David laughed. "Sorry, it was rather a fast one," he said. "I thought it had got you in the tummy. Jolly glad it was only your wicket." "So am I," remarked Humphreys. "Come and bathe." Since then, every day had added to the pace of the ground, and this Sunday afternoon, as David strolled down with Baggs, he looked at the turf with extreme content. "Just my luck all over," he said, "that it should be getting into the state that suits me best for old boys' match. Lord, what a pity I said that. I shan't be able to send down a decent ball now. But I should love to bowl Franks. Baggs, I do think about cricket so tremendously in the summer half. I lay awake making plans." He took a short run and brought his arm over his shoulder in a complicated fashion. "Why shouldn't I bring my arm up overhand like that," he said, "and turn my wrist over underhand? You might say that the ball would simply fly up gently in the air and fall at my feet. But something might be done with it. You can usually do something with anything if you give your mind to it." "Like you with Jev," remarked Baggs. "Oh, that's only Adams's rot." He broke off and focused his blue eyes on a group of figures coming up the field towards them. "Lord, here's Mother Gray and Violet coming," he said. "I say, is my tie straight? Who's the man with them?" "Don't know. Friend of theirs, probably." "Clever fellow. Hope they'll ask me to tea." David had been carrying his straw hat in his hand, but put it on in order to have the joy of taking it off to them. "Same man who was in chapel this morning with them," said Baggs in an undertone. "Was he? Didn't see him. Lord, doesn't she look ripping?" There is always some slight discomfort attached to a meeting which is seen, while yet a long way off, to be coming, a difficulty in knowing the right moment to cease being absorbed in the landscape or in an intelligent conversation with your friend, and to be conscious of it in proper time to apply a suitable smile of recognition to the face. David, with his tingling heart, managed it with wonderful ill success. He put on a brilliant smile long before it could be seen at all, and feeling as if his cheeks would crack, took it completely off again. Then he tried to talk to Baggs in a natural manner, and pointed to nothing at all away to the right. Then he proceeded to talk to Baggs again much too long, and did not look up till the adorable one was but a couple of yards off. On came the smile of recognition again, and he took off his hat and dropped it, and alas for the hope of being asked to tea. When he picked up his hat again, the vision had already gone by, and it was only the most instantaneous return of his smile that he reaped from all those muddled maneuvers. So on they went, Baggs with face red from suppressed giggles. "What are you laughing at, you ass?" asked David in an indignant whisper, I don't see anything funny." "No, you wouldn't. You were the funny man." "What did I do?" demanded David. "First you grinned an awful grin miles too soon," said Bags. "Then you looked as grave as a judge with indigestion. Then miles too late you gave another awful grin and dropped your hat. Sorry you didn't get your tea, but it was too funny for anything." David was radically incapable of ill humor for more than a few seconds at a time, and grinned in a less awful manner. "I never felt such a silly fool," he said, "and I'm not sure I like that man. What do you suppose they were talking about so interestedly?" "Can't say. Run back and ask them," said Bags. "I thought he looked rather a decent chap. Awfully good looking, too, a bit like Maddox." David gave a snort of disdain. "Like your grandmother," he observed in a withering manner. "Which one? I've got two." David took hold of Bags by the shoulders and ran him down the bit of steep hill to the gate. "The ugliest," he said, "and the fattest, and the beastliest. I say, though, it was rather a sell for me." "Complete suck," said Bags. There are exactly as many ways of falling in love as there are different natures in the world. And since everyone, boy or man or girl or woman, falls in love off the same carpet, so to speak, on which he transacts the other affairs of life, it followed that David's first excursion into the enchanted country was made with enthusiasm and gaiety and innocence, and with that forgetfulness of himself that characterized his other ways and works. That he was in love at all, any grown-up man, who was so unfortunate as to forget what it was like to be a boy, would probably have denied, calling his feelings calf-love at the most. But no boy, unless he was a shriveled old man, could doubt for a moment the genuineness of David's emotion. It seriously threatened for the next few weeks to dethrone the dominant passion inspired by cricket. And since that absolutely refused to vacate the supreme throne, love squeezed itself in and sat beside it, so that if David lay awake on Sunday pondering over fresh wiles in the matter of his googlies, on Monday the googlies would not enter his head at all, except as shadows, and he would devote the whole of his insomnia, which perhaps lasted half an hour, to the contemplation of the adorable Violet. At such times he would give vent to a sound between a sigh and a groan, and Jevons from the next bed would ask if he had a tummy ache. Then David would say savagely, "No, you little ass, go to sleep," and add in a minute or two, "Thanks for asking, Jev." At this high level his adoration remained for a whole month. Occasionally, as during the 2 days of the old boy's match, he would be more absorbed in cricket, while Violet looked on from the throne of his heart, even as she looked on from the balcony of the pavilion. But on the day succeeding the glorious discomfiture of the old boys, cricket, as an active principle in his mind, lapsed into a state of quiescence, while Violet became volcanic again. He did not want anything from her, though the thought of kissing her, a wild flight of impossible fancy, sent his heart into his mouth. He only wanted that she should be she, and he an adorer. He could have given no further account of it than that. All his other friends, Frank and his own sister, and Bags and Plugs, were on a different plane. He loved Marjorie, he loved Frank, he esteemed and relied on Bags, but none gave him any tremor, any sense of excitement. But for Violet, his boyish heart was full of a sweet tumult and confusion whenever the enchantress came within eye-shot. Meantime, the strange young man who had roused David's suspicions on Sunday afternoon continued staying with the Greys, but his presence was accounted for, since, to David's great relief, he proved to be a cousin. He proved also, which was satisfactory, to be a man who played cricket occasionally for his county, and thus had a claim to respect, and took part in a match against the Masters, playing for them. On that occasion he proceeded to hit David's bowling to all parts of the compass with the utmost ease and enjoyment, a feat that raised him in the bowler's estimation. Eventually David got him out with a ball about which Mr. Leonard Gray knew absolutely nothing, but he had been treated with wonderful contempt first, and as Gray retired he nodded in a friendly manner. "Glad you didn't send that ball down sooner, Blaize," he said. Then, with the suddenness of a thunderbolt, the end came. Bags brought the fateful news, while David was ecstatically employed on a model flying machine which Frank had given him. Did you ever see anything so ripping?" he shouted. "Frank sent it to me this morning. It flew the whole length of hall just now. Wait till I wind it up again." David picked up the beloved machine and began winding it. "What's up?" he said, looking at Baggs. "Anything beastly happen? Nothing wrong in the house, is there?" "Oh, David, I'm so sorry," said Baggs. David let go of the winder, and the propeller whirled and pulled as the wheels ran round. "We'll get on," he said. "She's engaged to that cousin," said Baggs. "Banns were given out yesterday at the parish church. Pluggs told me. His people were down and went with him to church instead of chapel." David felt the world topple round him. He sat down and turned very red in the face. "Oh," was all he said. Then Baggs came a step closer. "I say, David," he said, shyly, "if you only knew how I hate anything that hurts you, I should like to kill that chap." And his plain, rather goat-like face glowed with that which had so long inspired him, namely his affection for David, that shy, silent passion of friendship. David spun the propeller once or twice. "Well, he's a jolly lucky chap," he said at length. Then he looked at Baggs, and saw in his eyes just that blind devotion that you can see in a dog's eyes, if you understand dogs. He got up and put a hand on Baggs's shoulder. "It's ripping of you to care, Baggs," he said. "I'm no ungrateful." Hell! End of section 21.
Section 22 of David Blaize. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. David Blaize by E.F. Benson. Chapter 16. The school was assembled at evening chapel on the last Sunday of this summer term. Tomorrow would be prize giving, with all its attendant festivities, down to concert in the evening and another house supper, perhaps, at Adams's, in celebration of their again having won the house cricket cup. On Tuesday the school would break up, to meet again in large numbers on Friday for the match at Lord's. Just now the hymn, after the third collect, had been sung, but after that, instead of the chaplain continuing to read the prayers, the head did so. Next him in his pew was Frank, and before the prayer for all sorts and conditions of men, there was a short pause, and the silence became tense, for everyone present guessed what was coming. Then the quiet, slow voice began again. "Your prayers are requested for your friend, David Blaize," it said, "who is lying dangerously ill." Then the three remaining prayers were said, but before the final hymn was given out, there came another pause, and the head rose, and spoke more intimately now. "You will all want to know what news I have to give you," he said, "so before we finish the service I will tell you. I saw David Blaize just before chapel. He was quite conscious and not frightened at all. He knew quite well, for his father had told him, that he was in extreme danger. I only saw him for a minute, but I said we're going to pray for him this evening, as we have done. Perhaps you'd like to hear what he said to me." The head paused a moment, began once, and then mastered his voice better. He said, "Thanks awfully, sir. That'll do me good." A little rustle and stir went round chapel, and all that anyone had known of David came and stood quite close to him. Baggs, sitting at the end of the seat of the sixth form, leaned forward, putting his head on his hands. Frank, who had come down an hour before, just looked at the head, waiting. Then the head spoke again. "I've told you this on purpose," he said, "to show you how he faces death, if it is that God wishes him to face. Also to show you that, as he still hopes to live, we must hope it with him, in all the power that prayer gives us. But he faces death with the gay courage with which he faced that which has brought him into the peril of it. There are many of you who loved him, and I am among them, and we must be level with him in our courage. Now we will sing the hymn. Lead us, Heavenly Father, lead us." The whole school, of course, knew what had happened. 2 days before a young horse harnessed to a light cart and frightened by a traction engine had bolted straight down the steep High Street at Marchester, full at its lower end with the crowded traffic of market day, and the driver had been pitched off the box, so that it galloped on, unchecked and mad with fright. At the moment, David, with a bag of macaroons, which he had just bought, came out of a school shop, throwing the parcel to Baggs, who was with him. He had shouted out, Catch hold and don't eat any!" and had rushed straight out into the road, taking a header, so to speak, at the horse. He got hold of a rein, and then, still holding it, had been jerked off his feet, and the wheel of the cart had gone over him. But the horse was checked. When they picked the boy up, they found that the rein was still wrapped round his wrist. There were several internal injuries, not necessarily fatal, but until several days had elapsed, every minute was critical with danger. Up till this morning all had gone well, but a few hours ago there had been disquieting symptoms, with fever and restlessness and signs of exhaustion. He had been conscious all day, and was no longer in great pain, but it was feared that nervous shock consequent on internal injury might overcome the splendid powers of rallying which he had shown at first. His father and Marjorie had come down the day before, but to-day they had scarcely seen him, since the utmost quiet was necessary. And an hour ago he had been told that he was in great danger. It was to this that the head had referred. Adams's house was nearer to where the accident happened than the school sanatorium, and he had been moved there since every extra yard was extra danger, and for 2 days now a strange silence, as of life in a dream, had lain over it. There had been no need for Adams to tell them not to make any noise or disturbance, for the boys crept about like mice, and no voice was raised. It seemed impossible that this should have happened to anybody, most of all that it should have happened to David. And yet in the room at the end of the passage, just beyond the blazed door into Adams's private part of the house, he was lying now, midway between life and death, horribly tired, but not afraid. Maddox waited for their head to disrobe after service was over, just outside the chapel. The school and the masters passed by him, but he only nodded at one and another, and still waited. At last the head came out into the red twilight after sunset. "Glad you waited for me, Maddox," he said. "I didn't know you were down till just before chapel." "Is there anything more to tell than what you have told us, sir?" he asked. The head took his arm. "No, my dear fellow," he said. "It's not hopeless, you know. They don't say that." "Would they allow me to see him, sir?" "You needn't know I did. I could just look at him without his seeing me." "You must ask the doctor about that. You got down this afternoon only?" "Yes, sir. I only heard this morning." They walked on in silence a little way as far as the iron gate into the quadrangle. Then Maddox spoke again. "He's the best chap in the world, sir," he said. "He saved me, you know. Just saved me." The head pressed his arm. "Ah, that's between you and David," he said. "It's not for me to hear. But I know you love him, which is the only point. Please God, you'll have him with you many years yet, and if not, Frank, you mustn't be bitter, or think that it's a cruel ordinance that takes him away. God takes him, and we must give, even as David gave himself when he just jumped at that horse. Do you think he would have withheld himself if he had known what the result would have been? Not a bit of it. He would have done it just the same. We both knew that. His life was his, and, like the brick he is, he chose to risk it." They walked on in silence half across the quiet quadrangle. "Will you come and sup with us?" asked the head presently. "I can give you a bed too, if you like." "Oh, thanks awfully, sir," said Frank. "But I think I'll go down to the house. Mr. Adams will put me up somehow. Or I shall sit up. I should like to be down there." The head nodded. "I see," he said. "I quite understand. Good night, then." Maddox went out of schoolyard, and down the road to his old house. The afterglow of sunset was fading fast. The road showed grey between black hedgerows, and as he crossed the stream, the reflection of a big star wavered on the quiet, flowing water. The whole place was intensely familiar to him, part of his blood, part of his intimate life, and passing the Fives Court, he remembered how, on a wet day not yet 3 years ago, he had given David and Baggs elementary instruction in squash, and had walked down this same road afterwards, waiting for David to come in with a parcel for him. Now that friend of his heart lay between life and death, in the house of which the lights already shone between the elm trees. He tried to realize, and again shrank from realizing, what the loss would mean to him. He had 100 friends alive and well, but he could not measure David by any of them. He was just David. There was no fresh news when he got to the house. He saw David's father and sister for a minute only, but was not allowed to go in to see him. After that he went into the boys' part of the house, and found that Baggs was waiting up also, by permission, in the double prefect's study, which he shared with David. Maddox knew it well. It was the one he had managed to procure for himself alone the year that David came to the school and fagged for him. Baggs was full of quiet politeness. He gave Maddox a sofa, and, since the rest of the house had gone to bed, suggested that he might smoke if he wished. "Adams wouldn't mind," he said. "It's jolly of you to come and keep me company, you know." And then Baggs could not speak any more at once. "Thanks, I won't smoke," said Maddox. "You were with David at his private school too, weren't you?" "Yes, 2 years," said Baggs. "And been pals ever since, same as me. Both of us David's friends, I mean." Baggs forgot to be shy of this great Cambridge cricket blue. "You should have seen David," he said, jerking out the words. "Went bang for that horse, like taking a header. I ought to have done it, you know. I got out of school shop just in front of him and stood staring." "Oh my God, why didn't you?" said Maddox suddenly. "I know, it was rotten of me," he said. "But David was so damned quick about it, you know. He just chucked a bag of macaroons at me and simply jumped. And then the wheel went over him and he was dragged along with the rein round his wrist." Baggs gave one awful sniff and pointed to a white paper parcel that protruded from the cupboard where tea things were kept. "There they are," he said. "He told me not to eat any, last thing he said, and I want to see him again so frightfully, just to see him, you know. What a ripper! He didn't know how I liked him. You did too. Same boat, isn't it?" Baggs had no pretence of fortitude left, and mopped his eyes. "Damn that horse," he said. "Who'd have cared if it killed the whole High Street, so long as David didn't put his car case in the light? Silly, silly idiot. But a fellow just loves him the more for it. I keep thinking over day after day of these last 5 years. Do you remember when he was swished?" Maddox nodded. "Yes, jolly well deserved it too. He was so sick with me afterwards when I told him so. But we made it up. David said he was sorry. Silly fool. As if he ever did anything to a pal he could be sorry for." Baggs caught his breath. "Don't know what there was about him," he said. "But there he was, just David, you know. And he liked you most awfully. I used to get damned jealous. Sorry if you mind." The two sat there together while the warm night with many stars wheeled overhead above the sleeping house, talking occasionally, but for the most part in silence. Adams, who also was sitting up, came in from time to see them. They would sit all three together. From the sick room came no determining news. David was conscious and awake, and they had given him all the morphia that they dared. His temperature had not risen further, but he was very much exhausted. The question was how his strength would hold out unless he got to sleep. This Adams told them, and perhaps they talked for a little of David, recalling some incident of past days. Then Adams would leave them again to go back to David's father and sister. But not long after midnight he came in again, having only just gone out. "David has suddenly asked if you were here, Frank," he said. "He wants to see you, and the doctor thinks you had better go to him. He's getting very restless, and perhaps you may be able to quiet him. That's what they want you to do. You can trust yourself?" Frank got up. "Yes, sir, I know I can," he said. The room where he lay was lit by a lamp that was shaded from the bed. Near the head of it was standing the doctor, who nodded to Frank as he came in, and beckoned him to the bed, putting a chair for him by the side of it. "David, old chap, here I am," he said. David turned his tired eyes to him. "Oh, I say, that's rippin'," he said faintly. "But I can't see you very well. Mayn't there be a bit more light?" The doctor quietly tilted the shade round the lamp, so that the light fell on Frank's face. "Will that do?" said Frank. "Yes, rather. I want to see you awfully. I wondered if you would come. I thought perhaps you would, when you knew. Frank, am I going to die?" Frank pulled the chair a little closer, and bent over him. "No," he said. "You're not going to do nothing of the sort. He can't get on without you, possibly. So you've got to get well. See?" The doctor came close to Frank and whispered to him. "Tell him he must go to sleep," he said, and stepped back again out of sight. "And to get well," continued Frank, "you've got to go to sleep and bring your strength back. David, don't you remember our 2 beds at the end of dormitory? Well, think yourself back in yours with me and the one next to you, and imagine it's time to go to sleep. It's quite easy, you know. Imagine it's that jolly evening after our house match last year, and you were so tired you fell asleep without undressing." "Yes, I remember," said David. He was silent a little, but his eyes were still wide. "I say, would it bore you awfully to hold my hand?" he said. "You're so strong and fit and quiet. I might get some, I don't know. Am I talking rot?" "Not a bit. There!" Frank fitted his hand into David's, which lay like a sick child within it. "Yes, ripping," he said, a little drowsily. "Sure it's not an awful bore?" "It's a frightful bore," said Frank. David smiled. "You didn't get a rise out of me," he said. "Shall have another try before long," said Frank. "Comfortable?" "Rather." David lay for some 10 minutes, still wide-eyed, but quiet. Then his eyelids fluttered, closed, and opened again. "Awfully comfortable," he said. "I wanted just you to tell me what to do. I did so want you to come." David's eyelids dropped again, and the doctor came round to Maddox's side. "Sit quite still," he whispered, "and don't speak to him again." "Sure it doesn't bore you?" asked David once more. Again there was silence, and the two, the friend and the doctor, remained absolutely still for some 5 minutes. Then from the bed came a long sigh. David's head rolled a little sideways on the pillow, and after that came the quiet, regular breathing. Then the doctor whispered once more to Maddox. "You may have to sit like that, with your arm out for hours," he said. "We'll try to make you comfortable presently. Can you manage it?" "Why, yes," said he. The doctor quietly left the room, but came back soon after with pillows, and, as well as he could, propped up Maddox's outstretched arm. Then he spoke to the nurse, who was to sit up, and come back to the bed, and looked at David a moment, listening to his regular breathing. "I'm going to get a bit of sleep now," he whispered to Frank, "but I'm afraid you won't. You must stop just as you are. If he lets go of your hand, you must sit there in case he wakes and asks for you. If he says anything, answer him as if he was in his dormitory, and you in the bed next him. You're in charge." It was a couple of hours before David moved. Then he turned a little in bed. "Frank?" he said. "Oh, shut up and go to sleep," said Frank. "'Tisn't morning." "Righto," said David. All sensation had gone from Maddox's arm. It was still quite numb up to the shoulder, and it was only with his eyes that, presently after, he knew that David had let his hand slip from his own. Then very gently he withdrew it, and it fell helplessly onto his knees. David slept on through the hour before dawn when the flame of vitality burns dim, the dying loose their hold on life, until through the curtains the pale light of morning looked in, dimming the lamplight. Outside the twitter of birds began, and the hushed sounds of life stole about within the house, and the nurse moved quietly to and fro in the room, setting things in order for the day. She brought Frank a cup of tea and some bread and butter, and he ate and drank without moving from the bedside. Before long the doctor paid his promised visit, but there was nothing for him to do, now that sleep had come to David. The immediate necessity was fulfilled, and beyond that there was no need to look at present. Only hope, the little white flame, which had burned so dim and had come so near to being quenched the evening before, shone more bravely. All that morning Maddox sat by David's bed as he slept. It was he who had brought to him, through the tie of their love and David's instinctive obedience to his suggestion, the sleep that had come so imperative a need. And the sunny morning grew broad and hot as he dozed sometimes, but oftener watched, filled with a huge and humble exultation of happiness that he had been able to help David. When David woke, as he did, little after noon, it was the best of all, for even while his eyes were yet scarcely unclosed, he spoke just one word, Frank's name, still sleepily. "I'll go to sleep," said Frank, just as he had said it 12 hours before. "No early school." But this time David reasserted himself a little. "Course not," he said. "But I've slept ages, and I want something to eat." The beaming nurse stepped to the bedside. "I'll bring you some beef tea in a minute," she said. "Lie quite still." David turned his head. "Why, it's quite morning," he said. "Absolutely," said Frank. "And I've slept ever since you told me we were in dormitory together," he said. "How long ago was that?" "Oh, about 12 hours," said Frank. "You've sat here all that time?" "Think so." "Oh, I say. Just because you thought I might want you." David's eyes were bright and untired again. There was life shining behind them, young life that may still be feeble as the snowdrops raising their frail heads above the ground on some sunny morning of February are feeble, but the answer to the beckoning of spring, not, like late autumn blossoms, feeling the chill of the winter that approaches. Frank leaned over him. "Yes, I thought you might want me," he said, "but also I couldn't go away. I wanted you." David smiled at him. "I was pretty bad yesterday, wasn't I?" he asked. "Yes, pretty bad." "I know it must be, because I didn't care what happened. I do today. I'm going to get better. "Of course you are," said Frank. "And here's your food." "Lord, it smells good," said David. "Do be quick, nurse." So there was house supper at Adams's that night. End of section 22, read by Inkell. End of David Blaize by E.F. Benson.